Victor Frankl was a professor of neurology and psychiatry. He was born in 1905 and died in 1997. He's the founder of the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy, otherwise known as the School of Logotherapy. He also spent 3 years as a prisoner in different concentration camps in World War II. His writings, which span across more than 30 different books, are considered to be some of the most influential since the days of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. In this series of videos, we're going to analyze a number of takeaways from various parts of his best-known book, Man's Search for Meaning. Published in 1946, the book tells of the experiences that Victor Frankl had in the concentration camps, with an emphasis on where motivation for life can be born. The book also includes a brief summary of logotherapy itself, as well as an added part which talks about the case for tragic optimism. So, without further ado, let's get started. Instead of trying to analyze all the ideas at once, which are variable and span across the whole book, I think it would be best to take it part by part, quote by quote. The video may become larger than what I would expect, but I think it's worth it. In the preface on page 9, we see one of the most popular quotes that Victor Frankl has said. It reads, "The last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances." We're going to explain the quote later on because it is actually mentioned in the book and expanded more in detail, but I think you get the main idea. This man has been in literally one of the worst situations anyone could have ever been in human history, and Victor Frankl points out that even at that desperate moment, man has the freedom to choose how to behave. And I think that is probably the most important lesson of the whole book. If you have to take one lesson from the whole book, it's that. Because I think we find comfort in the idea that we can choose how to behave as long as the surrounding environment allows us to, because then we can blame the environment. But Frankl says no. Frankl says that no matter what excuse you can come up with, there is absolutely no reason for you to not pick the correct behavior based on the correct set of values, and I think that's a very important thing to know, and we're going to explain it afterwards. In the first 2 pages, Victor Frankl tries to explain the inability of a regular outsider to grasp the sheer amount of pain and suffering that people went through in the camps. I mean, you can read the whole book, you can read countless books on it, but you can never quite grasp it unless you're there. And that's a feature that a lot of different historical events have attached to them. Specifically, in the second paragraph of page 18, Victor Frankl says, "It is easy for the outsider to get wrong conception of camp life, a conception mingled with sentiment and pity. Little does he know of the hard fight for existence which raged among the prisoners. This was an unrelenting struggle for daily bread and for life itself, for one's own sake or for that of a good friend." Later, Frankl explains one of the tactics that the Nazis used in order to impose their cruelty without any sort of remorse. Specifically, I'm talking about the objectification of the prisoners. What they did was they attached a number to each person. They erased all of their records, everything, all the papers they had. All they kept was their number and what job they did so that they can use them in more specific ways. For example, Frankl was a doctor, so they wanted to know that he was a doctor. But his name had no value to them. All he was to them was a number. And that made it easier for them to act in the way that they were supposed to act. Quote, "The authorities were only interested in the captives' numbers. These numbers were often tattooed on their skin and also had to be sewn to a certain spot on their trousers, jacket or coat. Any guard who wanted to make a change against a prisoner just glanced at his number. He never spoke of his name." Speaking of the prisoners, according to Victor Frankl, the prisoners that were the most immoral were those who had the highest chance of surviving. We see that trait in many stories that we tell, but we don't quite have the opportunity to see it in real life because it takes a very desperate situation in order to test that behavior. For, as Victor himself puts it, "We who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return." I told you that this book analyzes some really dark ideas, and that's one of them. But I think we have to examine it in order to understand the nature of human behavior itself, because I can come here and speak about meaning and hope in desperate situations, but it's also just as important to acknowledge some of the realities of the way humans act, and sometimes that's very cruel. The book heavily explores the idea of the will to life, and I think one of the most interesting quotes about that is on page 22, where it says, "Once lost, the will to live seldom returns." Now, Frankl is obviously speaking about the prisoners who had lost hope completely, but I think it's one of the points that we can take home with us and that can be attached to any situation, because it speaks to how difficult it is to get out of a hopeless situation when you accept that it's hopeless. I think Frankl makes it very, very clear that people are tougher than they think, and that when they act on that toughness, or at least on the presupposition of the existence of that toughness, they can endure extremely difficult situations. But on the other side, if a person admits to its hopelessness and gives up early, there is no return from that, unless some kind of miracle happens. Later on, there is a scene that Victor Frankl explains, which truly made me shiver, and it's when he explains a situation where a guard was given the freedom to choose which prisoners would be sent to death and which prisoners would be kept in the camp in order to work until they were unable to work and then send them to death. So it's a very cruel scene in general, but I think the most important moment of that scene is when the guard is described as having a very casual way about it. So it says, "He was a tall man who looked slim and fit in his spotless uniform. What a contrast to us, who were untidy and grimy after our long journey. He had assumed an attitude of careless ease, supporting his right elbow with his left hand. His right hand was lifted, and with the forefinger of the hand he pointed very leisurely to the right or to the left. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movement of a man's finger, pointing now to the right and now to the left, but far more frequently to the left. It was the first selection, the first verdict made on our existence or non-existence." The reason I find this quote particularly important is because it speaks to the way in which evil expresses itself on man. Because I fundamentally believe that every person has both the capacity for good and the capacity for evil. But we see that when evil takes over someone's brain, let's say, it shows not only in what he does, but in the way that he does it. So we can at least spot the differences between the types of speech and the types of body language that one possesses when he acts something good versus when he acts something bad. And I think it's that fundamental difference that shows us the fact that good and bad are not subjective. And it's a side way to that argument, let's say, but I think it's extremely important, and I think that in these subtle ways we can point to when a person does good compared to not. I see it as a detecting tool, let's say. In the following pages, the book describes many difficult situations and cruel acts, but I'm not going to analyze them because they have been analyzed by a lot of different people and historians. But I do want to stand on the dehumanization aspect because I think it really has a psychological impact. So the guards would shave the prisoners and they would take all of their clothes off, everything they had, even rings, and they literally would leave them naked with no hair, no nothing. Sometimes they would let them see their friends be tortured and whipped with straps. Or, as Victor Frankl puts it, all we possessed, literally, was our naked existence. And I think it's really good to think about what that would feel like, because it will really give you a reason to be thankful for anything that you have. Just to know that people go through these type of situations throughout history, I think it's a great reminder that we live in a very privileged world and we don't have the right attitude towards it. Now we get to one of my favorite ideas of the whole book, and it's about two very powerful feelings that keep people from hopelessness and that kept people of the prison camps from committing suicide or from simply dying due to depression. And those are humor and curiosity. When I read this, I was like, this is literally what I've been saying my whole life. It's an idea that I truly think is profound, because oftentimes we disregard humor as something useless or as something that the privileged do. But in reality, humor is one of the only things that people can never take from you. They can take your clothes, they can beat you down, they can do whatever they want, but they cannot take away your sense of humor or your sense of curiosity. That's exactly what makes them so powerful in desperate situations like concentration camps. Here is how Victor Frankl says it. Quite unexpectedly, most of us were overcome by a grim sense of humor. We knew that we had nothing to lose except our ridiculously naked lives. When the showers started to run, we all tried very hard to make fun, both about ourselves and about each other. After all, real water did flow from the sprays. Apart from that strange kind of humor, another sensation seized us: curiosity. I have experienced this kind of curiosity before as a fundamental reaction toward certain strange circumstances. When my life was once endangered by a climbing accident, I felt only one sensation at that critical moment: curiosity. Curiosity as to whether I should come out of it alive or with a fractured skull or some other injury. Cold curiosity predominated even in Auschwitz, somehow detaching the mind from its surroundings, which came to be regarded as kind of objectivity. At that time, one cultivated this state of mind as a means of protection. We were anxious to know what would happen next, and what would be the consequence, for example, of our standing in the open air, in the chill of late autumn, stark naked and still wet from the showers. In the next few days, our curiosity evolved into surprise that we did not catch a cold. What we can take away from this is that no matter what happens, we should always put a smile on our faces and try to make situations funny, even when these situations seem completely wrong and tragic. Comedy is extremely valuable, especially in our times with cancel culture and the rest. So I think it's important to just remember to always stay curious and stay humorous. Let us not become machines who just calculate what a situation is objectively, let's say, and then act upon that with absolute rationality. Because in some situations, complete rationality in behavior is catastrophic. Sometimes you want to act irrationally, to act positively, even if it doesn't make sense, because that's the only way to get out of it. Moving on, we also read another interesting concept, which is that when death appears, the fear of it disappears. In other words, we are scared of what we don't know, not necessarily what we know as an enemy. This idea is heavily explored in horror movies and in horror in general. Because imagine if in every horror movie you just knew who was the killer and you just saw him come towards you and then kill you. No matter how gruesome or how terrible the death would be, it wouldn't scare you. What does scare you is when you don't see where or who is hiding in the shadows. So that's a testament to how human psychology works in terms of fear and the fear of death, or in this specific situation, a specific prisoner who was told he would die in 2 days. When he was told that, he was no longer scared of death. He just wanted to embrace it because, hey, what you gonna do? You have 2 days left, that's it. If you don't know whether or when you're going to die, that's when you're truly petrified. And that's a point that runs across the whole book all the time. Now I'm going to close the video with a final idea that is heavily analyzed in the book, and it has to do with what Victor calls Muslims. Not Muslims. Muslims is a different term that was used to describe a prisoner of the camps that had given up completely, that had lost hope, and that you could see it. He wouldn't shave, he would become terribly weak, he wouldn't even try to give the impression of being healthy. And some of us could understand that. I mean, in a situation as terrible as the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, you wouldn't expect people to exactly stand up straight, let's say. But one of the friends of Victor's in the camps once said the following: "One thing I beg you," he continued, "shave daily, if at all possible, even if you have to use a piece of glass to do it, even if you have to give your last piece of bread for it. You will look younger and the scraping will make your cheeks look ruddier. If you want to stay alive, there is your only way. Look fit for work. If you even limp because, let us say, you have a small blister in your heel, and the SS man spots this, he will wave you aside and the next day you're sure to be gassed. Do you know what we mean by a Muslim? A man who looks miserable, down and out, sick and emaciated. and who cannot manage hard physical labor any longer, that is a Muslim. Sooner or later, usually sooner, every Muslim goes to the gas chambers. Therefore, remember, shave, stand and walk smartly, then you need not be afraid of gas. This paragraph right here is one of the most important in the text, because it speaks to the importance of having a healthy external appearance and the effect that that can have to your psychology and to the way people perceive you. Now, obviously, we are not going to be gassed for walking with a limp or for looking down when we talk, but we will be treated differently, and it does show weakness on our part. And I think it's way more important than people think to walk confidently and speak as confidently as possible. Show the world that you're there to take the danger on, and that you're not just a peasant who's trying to survive. Because when you look that way, you're far more likely to act that way. And I think that's a great way to end this video. So we can take a lot of different lessons from this great human being, Victor Frankl. I think this book specifically is one of the most profound pieces of work in psychotherapy and in general of the 20th century, and I would highly recommend it to absolutely everybody. Now, we will continue this series because in this video I only managed to go up to like page 35 or something. Just imagine how much quality is condensed into this little book, but we'll talk about it then. For now, I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day. Thank you.